My name is Angelica Ruiz. I'm 28, and last Saturday at my cousin Elena's engagement party in downtown Riverside Heights, my father stood up during the toasts, looked directly at me, and said words that felt like glass breaking in my chest. Some people in this family came from trash, and no amount of fancy clothes or big city jobs will ever change that. The entire patio went silent. Wine glasses paused halfway to lips, my Aunt Carmen's fork clattered against her plate. I was the only person at that table he could have been talking about. The only one who'd left Millbrook Valley. The only one who didn't fit their neat little boxes of acceptable success. I sat there in my navy dress from Nordstrom, the one I'd bought specifically because it looked expensive but not flashy, and felt every pair of eyes burning into me like judgment made flesh. I didn't flinch. I've trained myself not to. I just reached for my water glass with steady hands and took a slow sip, letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable for everyone else instead of just me. That's when I noticed him. A distinguished man in his 60s standing near the entrance to the restaurant's garden area. Silver hair, perfectly tailored charcoal suit, and something about the way he carried himself that made people unconsciously step aside when he moved. He was watching me, not my father, not the uncomfortable shuffling of my relatives, me. His eyes held something I couldn't place at first. Recognition, maybe, or respect. When our gazes met across that crowded patio, he gave me the smallest nod, barely perceptible, but somehow it felt like he was saying, "I see you. I know who you are." Then he walked over to my father's table, leaned down, and whispered something that made my dad's face drain of all color faster than I'd ever seen. 3 words. That's all it took. 3 quiet words that made the man who'd just called me trash look like he'd seen a ghost. 20 minutes later, those 3 words would turn my entire world upside down. They would reveal a truth that my father had spent nearly 3 decades hiding, a truth that would explain why he'd always looked at me like I was something that didn't belong in his house, why he'd pushed so hard for me to stay small and local, why the mention of my grandfather, his own father-in-law, always made him change the subject with violent efficiency. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how we got here, because this story didn't start with that engagement party. It started 28 years ago when my mother died giving birth to me, and my father, Ricardo Ruiz, decided that raising his dead wife's daughter was a burden he'd carry with barely concealed resentment. Growing up, he never let me forget that I was different, not his blood, not really his family. He'd married my mother Isabella when she was already pregnant with me, a fact he thought I didn't know but had overheard during one of his louder arguments with my aunt years ago. My half-siblings, Diego and Paloma, they were his real children. They got the encouragement, the pride, the "that's my kid" moments when they brought home decent grades or scored goals in soccer. Me? I got lectures about knowing my place, about not getting too big for my britches, about remembering where I came from, which, according to him, was nowhere special. "Your mother's people," he'd say with this particular tone that made it sound like a disease, "they always thought they were better than everyone else. Don't you go making the same mistake." But here's the thing about being told you're nothing your entire childhood. It either breaks you or it builds something fierce inside you. For me, it lit a fire that no amount of his cold water could put out. Every time he told me to aim lower, I aimed higher. Every time he suggested community college might be more realistic for someone like me, I studied harder for those scholarship applications. When I got into Northwestern University with a full ride, he didn't come to my graduation. When I landed my first job at Morrison & Associates, the premier architectural firm in Chicago, he told people I was playing secretary in some big building. When I bought my condo in Lincoln Park at 26, he said I was probably in debt up to my eyeballs trying to live above my station. I stopped trying to prove myself to him years ago. I stopped coming home for every holiday, stopped calling every week, stopped pretending that his approval was something I needed to function. But family events, The weddings, the quinceañeras, the engagement parties, those I still showed up for. Because my cousins didn't deserve to pay for his issues. And because some small part of me always hoped that maybe this time would be different. It never was. Until last Saturday. Until that moment when a stranger's whispered words made my father's carefully constructed wall of contempt crumble like sand. So tell me, if you'd spent your whole life being told you came from nothing, that you were nothing, would you have stayed quiet when the truth finally surfaced? Or would you have demanded every answer, every explanation, every single detail about the lies that shaped your entire existence? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one, and trust me, after what I discovered about my real family history, I need to know that I'm not alone in feeling like my entire childhood was built on someone else's shame and fear. Because what that distinguished stranger revealed about my grandfather didn't just change how I saw my past, it changed everything I thought I knew about who I really am.
The silence that followed my father's declaration stretched like a held breath across the entire patio. You know that moment when everyone at a party suddenly realizes they've walked into someone else's family drama? That was happening in real time. My cousin Elena, the bride-to-be, looked like she wanted to crawl under the beautifully decorated table. Her fiancé Miguel kept glancing between me and my father like he was watching a tennis match where someone might get hurt. But I didn't break. I've spent years perfecting the art of staying calm when people expect me to shatter. So I set my water glass down with deliberate precision, smoothed my napkin across my lap, and met my father's eyes with the kind of steady gaze that said, "Is that all you've got?" That's when the distinguished man moved. He wasn't rushed about it, didn't storm over or create a scene. He simply excused himself from his conversation near the garden entrance and walked with the kind of measured confidence that made people naturally step out of his way. I watched him approach our table, noting how my Uncle Fernando immediately sat up straighter, how my Aunt Carmen's eyes widened slightly when she took in his expensive suit and the way he carried himself. This wasn't just some random wedding guest. This was someone who mattered. He stopped directly behind my father's chair. Ricardo was still basking in what he probably thought was his moment of truth-telling, completely unaware that the entire dynamic was about to shift. The man leaned down, not in a threatening way, but with the casual authority of someone used to being listened to, and spoke 3 words so quietly that only my father could hear them. Samuel Delgado's granddaughter. I didn't catch the exact words at first, but I saw their effect immediately. My father's face went from smug satisfaction to something between terror and recognition. His hands, which had been gesturing confidently moments before, suddenly trembled as they reached for his wineglass. The color drained from his cheeks so fast I thought he might actually faint right there at the table. The stranger straightened up, gave me another one of those knowing nods, and walked away without another word. Just like that. No dramatic speeches, no confrontation, no scene, but somehow in those few seconds, the entire power structure of our family gathering had flipped upside down. "Ricardo!" My Aunt Carmen's voice cut through the tension. "What did he say to you? You look like you've seen a ghost." My father opened his mouth, closed it, then opened it again like a fish gasping for air. Nothing. He didn't say anything important. But his voice cracked on the word important, and everyone at the table heard it. That's when I realized something profound. For the first time in my entire life, my father was afraid of me. Not angry at me, not disappointed in me, not condescending toward me. Afraid. The man who had spent 28 years making me feel like an unwanted burden was suddenly looking at me like I might be dangerous. "Who was that man?" Elena asked, trying to salvage her engagement party from the weird tension that had settled over everything like fog. "Governor Harrison," Miguel replied quietly. "Thomas Harrison. I didn't even know he was coming tonight." Governor. The word hit me like a physical blow. The governor of Illinois had just walked over to our table, whispered something about someone named Samuel Delgado, and made my father look like he'd rather be anywhere else on earth. And he'd called me Samuel Delgado's granddaughter. I'd never heard that name in my life, not once. In 28 years of existing, in all the stories about my mother's family, and all the rare moments when my father actually talked about my maternal relatives, the name Samuel Delgado had never come up. Not ever. But Governor Harrison knew it. Knew it well enough to use it as some kind of weapon that could reduce my father to a trembling mess with just 3 whispered words. I excused myself from the table, claiming I needed to use the restroom, but really I needed space to think. As I walked through the restaurant toward the ladies' room, I caught fragments of whispered conversations that followed in my wake. Did you see Ricardo's face? Who is Samuel Delgado? Why would the governor know Angelica? Something's not right here. In the bathroom mirror, I stared at my own reflection and tried to process what had just happened. The same dark eyes that I'd always had, the same angular cheekbones that my father always said came from my mother's people, the same stubborn jawline that got me in trouble for asking too many questions as a child. But now, I was wondering, had I been looking at the wrong heritage my entire life? Had my father been hiding more than just his resentment about raising someone else's child? My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Ms. Ruiz, when you're ready for answers about your grandfather, I'll be in the oak grove behind the restaurant. Take your time. T.H. Governor Harrison was offering me the truth my father had apparently been hiding for decades. The question was, did I have the courage to hear it? Because something told me that once I learned who Samuel Delgado really was, there would be no going back to the small, unwanted life my father had always insisted was all I deserved.
I walked back to the table on unsteady legs, Governor Harrison's text burning in my phone like a secret I wasn't ready to carry. My father was nursing his wine with shaking hands, and the conversation had moved to safer territory. Alana's wedding dress, the honeymoon plans, anything that didn't involve mysterious governors or names that made grown men go pale. But I couldn't focus on small talk anymore. Not when my entire understanding of my family history was crumbling like old paint. So I sat there, smiled when appropriate, and let my mind drift back to everything I thought I knew about where I came from. Growing up in Millbrook Valley, population 8,400, meant everyone knew everyone else's business. Except, apparently, when it came to mine. My father had always been vague about my mother's family. City people, he'd say, with that particular dismissive tone he reserved for anything he considered above his station. Thought they were too good for small towns like this one. According to the official Ricardo Ruiz version of events, my mother Isabella had been some kind of rebel who'd run away from her fancy family to slum it with a blue-collar mechanic. They'd had a whirlwind romance, gotten married quickly, and then she'd died in childbirth, leaving him stuck with a baby that reminded him daily of everything he'd lost. It was a tragic story, and I'd believed every word of it for most of my life. It explained why my father looked at me with such complicated emotions, love mixed with resentment, duty mixed with regret. It explained why he never talked about my maternal grandparents, why there were no pictures of my mother's family in our house, why I'd grown up feeling like half of my identity was a blank slate. What it didn't explain was why my father's hands were still trembling 20 minutes after hearing the name Samuel Delgado. I started paying closer attention to the family dynamics I'd always taken for granted, like how my Uncle Fernando, my father's older brother, kept shooting worried glances in my direction, or how my Aunt Carmen seemed to be avoiding eye contact with me entirely, which was weird because she'd always been the relative who asked about my job and actually seemed proud of my accomplishments. Then there was the matter of my appearance. Growing up, people always commented on how different I looked from my half-siblings. Diego and Paloma had their father's stocky build, dark hair, and round faces. I was taller, angular, with lighter skin and features that didn't quite fit the Ruiz family mold. My father always explained this away by saying I looked like my mother's people. But now I was wondering what exactly that meant. Because If my mother came from some generic city family that thought they were too good for Millbrook Valley, why would the governor of Illinois know my grandfather's name? And why would that name have the power to terrify my father? The more I thought about it, the more questions bubbled up, like why my father had always been so adamant about me staying local, not just encouraging me to stick around, actively fighting against every opportunity that might take me away from his sphere of control. When I'd gotten to Northwestern, he'd spent weeks trying to talk me out of accepting the scholarship. College is just a way for rich people to separate you from your family, he'd said. You think you're too good for us now? When I'd landed the job at Morrison and Associates, he'd called it putting on airs. When I'd started making real money, enough to help out my siblings with college expenses and car payments, he'd accused me of throwing your success in our faces. At the time, I'd chalked it up to his insecurity about my education and professional success. But now I was wondering if there was something more calculated about his efforts to keep me small and invisible. Something that went beyond simple jealousy or resentment. The engagement party was winding down, but I couldn't leave. Not yet. I needed to understand what had just happened, and Governor Harrison was apparently waiting in the oak grove with answers I'd been denied my entire life. But first, I had to try one more time with my family. "Dad," I said during a lull in conversation, keeping my voice casual, "who's Samuel Delgado?" The effect was immediate and devastating. My father's wine glass slipped from his fingers, shattering against the concrete patio and sending red liquid spreading across the ground like spilled blood. Uncle Fernando choked on his beer. Aunt Carmen actually gasped out loud. "Where did you hear that name?" my father demanded, his voice hoarse with something that sounded like panic. "The governor mentioned it," I said simply. "Said I was his granddaughter. I thought you might know who he was talking about." The silence that followed was different from the earlier awkwardness. This was the silence of secrets being dragged into the light, of carefully constructed lies starting to collapse under the weight of truth. I could practically see the wheels turning in my father's head as he tried to figure out how to handle this moment he'd clearly hoped would never come. "That man doesn't know what he's talking about," he finally said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Your grandfather is dead, has been since before you were born." "Which grandfather?" I pressed. "Because you've never told me his name, never told me anything about him, actually." My father stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the concrete. "We're leaving." But I didn't move. For the first time in my life, I had leverage. And I wasn't about to waste it. "I'm not going anywhere until someone tells me the truth." That's when I realized the entire patio had gone quiet again. Not just our table, but everyone. Elena's engagement party had become the Angelica Ruiz family revelation show, and all the guests were watching to see what would happen next. And in that moment, I made a decision that would change everything. I stood up, smoothed my dress, and looked my father directly in the eyes. "If you won't tell me about Samuel Delgado," I said loud enough for everyone to hear, "then I guess I'll have to ask the governor myself." The look of pure terror that crossed his face told me everything I needed to know. Whatever truth he'd been hiding, it was big enough to bring down the carefully constructed world he'd built around his version of my story. And I was about to find out just how big. The walk to the oak grove behind Riverside Heights restaurant felt like the longest 100 yards of my life. Each step carried me further away from the family gathering that had just imploded, and closer to answers I wasn't sure I was ready to hear. The distant sound of nervous chatter from the patio faded behind me, replaced by the soft rustle of leaves and the hammering of my own heartbeat. Governor Harrison was waiting exactly where he'd said he'd be, standing beneath the largest oak tree with his hands clasped behind his back. Up close, he looked even more distinguished than he had at the party, the kind of man who commanded rooms just by walking into them. But there was something gentle in his eyes, something that reminded me of how my mother's sister Carmen used to look at old photographs when she thought no one was watching. "Ms. Ruiz," he said, extending his hand. Thank you for coming. I wasn't sure you would. I wasn't sure either, but I need to know who Samuel Delgado was, and why mentioning his name made my father look like he'd seen the devil himself. Governor Harrison smiled sadly. Your father has good reason to fear that name. Samuel Delgado built half of this state, quite literally. Roads, bridges, the university system, entire neighborhoods that house thousands of families. But more than that, he built a legacy that your father has spent nearly 3 decades trying to hide from you. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Why would he hide something like that? Because Samuel Delgado was your maternal grandfather, and he was also the man who publicly destroyed Ricardo Ruiz's father in a corruption scandal that made front-page news for 6 months back in 1987. The pieces started clicking together in my mind, puzzle fragments that had never made sense, suddenly forming a picture I didn't like. What kind of scandal? Governor Harrison pulled out his phone and showed me a photograph, a newspaper clipping from the Chicago Tribune dated March 15, 1987. The headline read, "Construction company owner arrested in multi-million-dollar fraud case." Below it was a photo of a man who looked disturbingly like an older version of my father being led away in handcuffs. Eduardo Ruiz, your father's father, was awarded several major construction contracts through the state in the mid-1980s. Roads, public buildings, infrastructure projects worth tens of millions of dollars. The problem was Eduardo was cutting corners, using substandard materials, paying workers below minimum wage, falsifying safety inspections. Buildings that should have lasted decades were developing cracks within years. I stared at the photograph, trying to process what I was hearing. And my grandfather, Samuel, he exposed this? Samuel Delgado was the state inspector general at the time. When reports started coming in about structural problems with Eduardo's projects, Samuel launched an investigation. What he found was systematic fraud on a massive scale. Eduardo wasn't just cutting corners, he was actively endangering lives. An elementary school Eduardo's company had built in Rockford nearly collapsed during a storm because the foundation work was so shoddy. The governor swiped to another photo, this one showing a man in a suit standing in front of what looked like a partially collapsed building. The man had my eyes, my jawline, my stubborn chin. Samuel Delgado looked exactly like what I might look like if I were a 60-year-old man in 1987. Samuel could have handled it quietly, could have given Eduardo a chance to fix the problems and avoid criminal charges. Instead, he chose to do the right thing, knowing full well it would destroy the Ruiz family financially and socially. Eduardo went to prison for 8 years. The family lost everything, their house, their business, their reputation in Millbrook Valley. And my father blamed my mother's family for ruining his life, I said, the picture becoming clearer. More than blamed. Ricardo was 18 when his father was arrested, about to graduate high school with plans to take over the family construction business. Instead, he watched his father get dragged away in handcuffs while Samuel Delgado stood at a podium explaining to reporters why justice had to be served, regardless of the personal cost. I thought about my father's bitterness, his constant anger, his need to keep me small and local and unaware of my potential. So when he married my mother, Isabella Delgado was Samuel's only daughter. She met Ricardo in college, fell in love with him before either of them knew about their family's history. By the time the truth came out, she was already pregnant with you. The governor showed me another photograph, a wedding picture from 1995. My mother looked radiant in white lace, but my father looked tense, almost angry even, on what should have been the happiest day of his life. Standing behind my mother was a distinguished older man who looked like an aged version of the Samuel from the newspaper clipping. Samuel attended the wedding? I asked. Against the advice of everyone who knew him. He loved Isabella more than his own life, and he was determined to support her choice, even if it meant standing in the same room as the son of the man he'd sent to prison. But Ricardo saw it differently. He saw it as the ultimate humiliation, marrying into the family that had destroyed his own. I sank onto a nearby bench, overwhelmed. My mother died when I was born. In childbirth, yes. And suddenly, Ricardo was left raising the granddaughter of his family's greatest enemy, the living reminder of both his greatest love and his deepest shame. That's why he never talks about her family, why there are no pictures, no stories, no connection to that side of my heritage. Samuel tried to maintain contact after Isabella died. He wanted to be part of your life, to help raise you, to make sure you knew where you came from. But Ricardo refused all contact, moved you both to Millbrook Valley where Samuel couldn't easily reach you, and spent the next 28 years making sure you never learned the truth about your grandfather's legacy. I looked up at the governor through tears I hadn't realized were falling. What legacy? What did Samuel build that was so important? Governor Harrison's smile was full of pride and sadness. Samuel Delgado spent 30 years in public service after the Eduardo Ruiz case. He became the most respected inspector general in Illinois history, then moved on to urban planning and infrastructure development. The reason Illinois has some of the best public transportation systems in the Midwest, Samuel designed them. The scholarship program that got you into Northwestern, Samuel created it specifically to help kids from working-class families access higher education. The irony was devastating. The scholarship that had launched my entire career, that had lifted me out of Millbrook Valley and given me the life I'd built in Chicago, it had been created by the grandfather my father had spent 30 decades hiding from me. "There's more," Governor Harrison said gently, "but I think that's enough revelation for one day. The question now is, what do you want to do with this information?" I stared back toward the restaurant, where my father was probably still trying to explain away what had happened. 28 years of lies, of manufactured shame, of being told I came from nothing when I actually came from one of the most respected public servants in state history. "I want to know everything," I said finally. "Every detail, every story, every piece of my heritage that he stole from me." Governor Harrison nodded. "Then we have a lot more to discuss, but not tonight. Tonight you need to decide how you're going to handle your father." As I walked back toward the restaurant, I realized I wasn't the same person who had left 30 minutes earlier. I was Samuel Delgado's granddaughter, and that meant something in this state. That carried weight and history and responsibility. My father was about to learn just how much weight. I walked back into the restaurant with my chin higher than it had ever been, carrying the weight of Samuel Delgado's legacy like armor I'd just discovered I'd always owned. The engagement party was winding down, most guests having sensed the family drama and made polite exits. Only the core family remained: my father, Aunt Carmen, Uncle Fernando, and my cousins Elena and Miguel, all clustered around the main table like survivors of a shipwreck. They looked up when I approached, and I could see the questions burning in their eyes. But my father's expression that stopped me cold. Not fear anymore. Resignation. Like he spent the last 30 minutes accepting that his carefully constructed house of lies was about to come crashing down. "So," I said, taking my seat with deliberate calm, "anyone want to explain why you've all been lying to me about who I am for my entire life?" The silence stretched until my Aunt Carmen finally cracked. "Angelica, mija, it wasn't supposed to be like this. We thought it would be easier if you didn't know." "Easier for who?" I kept my voice level, professional, the same tone I used in client meetings when someone tried to present me with substandard architectural plans. Easier for me to grow up thinking I had no family history, no legacy, no reason to be proud of where I came from? Uncle Fernando shifted uncomfortably. "Your grandfather, Samuel, he was complicated." "Complicated how?"
Because from what I just heard, he was one of the most respected public servants in Illinois history. The man who built half of the infrastructure you drive on every day. The man whose scholarship programs helped thousands of kids like me escape small towns and build real lives.
My father finally spoke, his voice hoarse. He destroyed our family. No, I said, surprising myself with the steel in my voice. Your father destroyed your family when he decided to commit fraud and endanger people's lives. Samuel just made sure he faced consequences for it. You don't understand what it was like, my father snapped, some of his old fire returning. Watching your father get dragged away in handcuffs while the whole town watched, having to sell everything we owned to pay for lawyers, starting over with nothing because some righteous inspector general decided to make an example out of us. And you don't understand what it was like? I shot back, growing up thinking I came from nothing, being told I was reaching above my station every time I achieved something, having my own father act like my success was somehow an insult to the family. Elena tried to play peacemaker. Maybe we should all just— No. I held up a hand. I've been quiet about this family's dysfunction for 28 years. Tonight, we're going to have the conversation we should have had decades ago. I pulled out my phone and showed them the photograph Governor Harrison had shared. Samuel Delgado at my mother's wedding, proud and dignified despite standing in a room full of people who hated him. This man loved his daughter enough to show up to her wedding even though he knew he wasn't wanted. He loved her enough to put aside his own feelings about the Ruiz family and support her choice. My father's jaw tightened. He was rubbing it in our faces, showing up like he owned the place. Or maybe he was being a father who wanted to be there for the most important day of his daughter's life. I swiped to another photo the governor had sent while I was walking back, Samuel holding a baby that could only be me. And this is him trying to be a grandfather to the daughter Isabella died giving birth to. But you made sure that never happened, didn't you? Carmen was crying now. Ricardo, you never told us he tried to stay in touch? Because it would have been torture for everyone involved. Every time I looked at Angelica, I saw Isabella. Every time I saw Isabella's face, I remembered that her father was the reason my own father died in prison. The words hung in the air like a bomb that had just exploded. I'd known Eduardo Ruiz had gone to prison, but I hadn't known he died there. Dad died of a heart attack in his cell in 1993, 8 months before he was supposed to be released. I felt a stab of something, not quite sympathy, but understanding. My father had been carrying the weight of his father's death, his family's disgrace, and his complicated feelings about my mother's family for 30 years. But that didn't excuse what he'd done to me. I'm sorry about your father, I said carefully. I'm sorry about the scandal and the financial ruin and all of it, but that doesn't give you the right to steal my heritage from me. Samuel Delgado wasn't just the man who investigated your father. He was my grandfather, my blood, my legacy, and you had no right to keep that from me. What legacy? My father demanded. What did his so-called legacy ever do for you? I almost laughed at the irony. The scholarship that got me into Northwestern, the one that changed my entire life, Samuel created that program. The urban planning principles I use in my work every day, Samuel helped develop them. The reason I was able to get my job at Morrison and Associates, because they specifically recruit from programs that Samuel's foundation supports. The color drained from my father's face as the full scope of the irony hit him. You're lying. I wish I was. I pulled up the Morrison and Associates website on my phone and showed him the About Us page, where the Delgado Foundation was listed as a major partner in their minority recruitment initiatives. I got my dream job, at least partially, because of programs my grandfather created. The grandfather you spent my entire childhood telling me I should be ashamed of. Carmen was staring at my father like she was seeing him for the first time. Ricardo, how could you not tell her? How could you let her think she came from nothing when she came from Samuel Delgado? Because I didn't want her to become like him, my father exploded, self-righteous and superior and thinking she was better than the rest of us. You mean successful? Accomplished? Dedicated to public service? Those are the qualities you were afraid I would develop?
"You don't get it," he said desperately. "People like Samuel Delgado, they think they're saviors. They think they have the right to destroy families in the name of doing what's right. They think their principles matter more than people's lives." I stood up, gathering my purse and dignity. "And you think that family loyalty means covering up corruption and letting innocent people get hurt? You think that protecting your ego is more important than your daughter knowing who she really is?" As I turned to leave, Elena grabbed my arm. "Angelica, please don't go like this. We're family." I looked around the table at these people who shared my blood and my history, but had never really known me. "No," I said softly. "Family doesn't lie to each other for 30 years. Family doesn't steal someone's identity and heritage and call it protection." I paused at my father's chair, looking down at this man who had shaped my entire worldview through his bitterness and shame. Samuel Delgado spent his life building things that would outlast him and help people he'd never meet. You've spent 30 years tearing me down to make yourself feel better about your father's choices. Guess which legacy I'm going to follow? Walking out of that restaurant, I felt like I was shedding an old skin. For the first time in my life, I understood why I'd always felt like I didn't quite fit in Millbrook Valley, why I'd been driven to achieve things beyond what anyone expected, why I'd always felt like I was capable of more than the small life my father wanted for me. I wasn't just Angelica Ruiz, the unwanted reminder of Ricardo's complicated past. I was Angelica Delgado Ruiz, granddaughter of a man who had built schools and bridges and futures for thousands of people. And it was time I started acting like it. The drive back to my Lincoln Park condo should have taken 45 minutes. Instead, I found myself pulling into a 24-hour diner in Oakbrook, needing time to process everything before I faced my empty apartment and the weight of what I'd just learned. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as I slid into a corner booth, ordering coffee I didn't want from a waitress who looked like she'd seen every kind of family drama play out in these vinyl seats. My phone had been buzzing constantly since I left the restaurant. Text after text from my Aunt Carmen, my Uncle Fernando, even Elena trying to smooth things over. I ignored them all, except one. Another message from Governor Harrison with a simple address and the words, "When you're ready to learn about what Samuel built, this is where his story really lives. No pressure, take your time." The address was for something called the Delgado Community Center in Pilsen, a neighborhood I'd driven through countless times but never really explored. I Googled it while sitting in that diner booth, and what I found made my untouched coffee grow cold as I stared at my phone screen. The Delgado Community Center wasn't just a building. It was an empire of social programs, after-school tutoring for immigrant kids, job training programs for adults seeking better careers, a legal aid clinic that helped families navigate housing disputes and workers' compensation claims, English classes, citizenship preparation, small business development workshops. The website showed dozens of success stories, families who had transformed their lives through programs Samuel had designed and funded. But what hit me hardest was the photo gallery. Picture after picture of Samuel Delgado at ribbon cuttings, graduation ceremonies, community events. Not the stiff, formal inspector general from the newspaper clippings, but a man who genuinely loved being around people who were building better lives for themselves. In every photo, he had the same expression I'd seen in Governor Harrison's face earlier. Pride mixed with determination, like someone who understood that real change happened one person at a time. There was something else in those photos, too. Samuel looked like me. Not just the physical resemblance I'd noticed before, but something deeper. The way he stood, the way he looked directly at whoever was taking the picture, the slight stubborn tilt to his chin that I recognized from my own mirror. We had the same energy, the same presence. I was still scrolling through photos when my phone rang. Unknown number, but something told me to answer. Angelica. The voice was elderly, female, uncertain. "This is Maria Santos. I worked with your grandfather for 30 years. Governor Harrison gave you your number, said you might want to hear some stories about Samuel." I sat up straighter. "Yes, I'd like that very much." I was his assistant at the Inspector General's office, then followed him when he started the foundation.
That man, Mija, he changed so many lives, but losing Isabella and then being cut off from you, her voice trailed off. It broke something in him that never quite healed. He really tried to stay in contact? Tried? Honey, he never stopped trying. Every birthday, every Christmas, every school milestone he could find records of, your father returned every letter unopened, refused every phone call. Samuel hired a private investigator just to make sure you were safe and healthy, because that was the only way he could keep track of you. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. He was having me watched? Not watched, protected. When you were 7 and that boy at school was bullying you, Samuel made sure the school district got a new anti-bullying program with trained counselors. When you were 14 and your father couldn't afford to fix the roof after that bad storm, Samuel anonymously donated to a community fund that helped families with home repairs. When you applied for colleges, he made sure every single scholarship program he had any influence over knew your name. I was crying now. Ugly sobs that I couldn't control. He did all that without me knowing? He said he couldn't be your grandfather in the traditional way, but he could still take care of you from a distance. The Northwestern scholarship? That wasn't just about your grades, though they were excellent. Samuel personally reviewed your application and your essay about growing up feeling displaced. He said you wrote about searching for your place in the world like someone who already knew she was meant for something bigger. The waitress refilled my coffee without asking, giving me a sympathetic look that suggested she'd seen plenty of people have emotional breakdowns in her diner.
There's something else, Maria continued. Samuel left everything to you. Not just money, though there's plenty of that, but the foundation, the community center, the scholarship programs. All of it. He's been gone for 3 years now, and his lawyers have been trying to find a way to contact you without going through your father. He's dead? The words came out as a whisper. Passed peacefully in 2022, heart attack at home. But honey, he made sure his work would continue. There are sealed letters for you, videos he recorded, a whole room in his house that he kept like a shrine to the granddaughter he never got to know. Photos he collected from your school websites, newspaper clippings when you got your first job, everything he could find about your life. I couldn't speak. Couldn't process the magnitude of what she was telling me. My grandfather, this man I'd never met, whose name I'd never even heard until tonight, had been the invisible guardian angel of my entire life. Every major break I'd gotten, every opportunity that had seemed like luck or merit, had been touched by his quiet influence. The lawyers need to meet with you, Maria said gently. There are documents to sign, properties to transfer, programs that need someone to oversee them. Samuel designed it all to run without him, but he always hoped that someday you'd want to take an active role. I don't know anything about running a foundation. You know about architecture, about building things that last. You know about working hard and achieving goals despite people trying to hold you back. Most importantly, you know what it feels like to be underestimated and dismissed. That's exactly what the kids in our programs face every day. After I hung up, I sat in that diner booth for another hour, staring out at the empty parking lot and trying to wrap my head around the complete reversal of everything I thought I knew about my life. I wasn't just the unwanted burden who'd clawed her way out of a small town through determination and luck. I was the heir to a legacy of public service, the inheritor of programs that had changed thousands of lives, the granddaughter of a man who had never stopped loving me, even though we'd never met. And my father had stolen all of it from me. Not just the money or the property, though those were staggering, but the connection, the sense of belonging, the understanding of where my drive and ambition came from. I wasn't an anomaly in the Ruiz family. I was Samuel Delgado's granddaughter, carrying on a tradition of building things that mattered. By the time I finally drove home, I'd made a decision. I was going to meet with Samuel's lawyers. I was going to learn about every program, every initiative, every dream he'd built and maintained, and then I was going to figure out how to honor his legacy while building something new.
But first, I was going to have one more conversation with my father, because 30 years of lies deserved more than just walking away from a restaurant table. This time, I wouldn't be going as the confused daughter begging for scraps of approval. I'd be going as Samuel Delgado's heir, with all the power and responsibility that came with that name. And Ricardo Ruiz was going to learn exactly what kind of legacy he'd tried so hard to hide from me. 3 days later, I was sitting in the mahogany-paneled conference room of Brennan, Walsh & Associates, the most prestigious law firm in Chicago, staring at documents that redefined my entire existence. Samuel's lawyers had laid out the scope of my inheritance like generals presenting battle plans. Foundation assets worth $47 million, the community center building and 3 satellite locations, a house in Evanston that I apparently owned for 3 years without knowing it, and a trust fund that had been quietly accumulating interest since my birth. But the personal items, that destroyed me. Margaret Walsh, the senior partner handling Samuel's estate, slid a leather portfolio across the table with hands that shook slightly from age or emotion. "These are the letters your grandfather wrote to you every year on your birthday. 28 of them. He sealed each one and gave them to us with instructions that they should only be opened if he died before meeting you or if he came looking for answers about your family." The first letter was dated 3 months after my birth, written in careful script on cream-colored stationery that still smelled faintly of Samuel's cologne, something woody and expensive that reminded me of the governor's presence. "My dearest Angelica, you are 3 months old today, and I have held you exactly once at the hospital the day after Isabella died, when Ricardo was too broken to stop me. You have your mother's eyes, but your own stubborn chin, and I suspect you're going to need that stubbornness for what lies ahead. I want you to know that every day you exist is a gift your mother gave the world, and I will spend my life making sure that gift has every opportunity to flourish, whether your father allows me in your life or not." I couldn't read past the first page without breaking down completely. Margaret Walsh tactfully left the room, giving me privacy to absorb 28 years of love letters from a grandfather who'd watched my life from the shadows. The letters chronicled everything: my first steps, gleaned from photos he'd somehow obtained, my struggles in middle school when I didn't fit in with the other kids in Millbrook Valley, my academic achievements, which he celebrated with the pride my father had never shown, my college acceptance, my first job, my promotion to senior architect, all documented with a grandfather's fierce joy and protective concern.
But it was the letter from my 18th birthday that broke something open inside me. "Angelica, you are legally an adult today, and I have wrestled with whether to contact you directly now that Ricardo can't legally prevent our relationship. But I know that suddenly appearing in your life would cause more pain than healing. You have built yourself into someone extraordinary despite the limitations placed on your understanding of your heritage. I am proud beyond words of the woman you're becoming, and I trust that when you're ready to know about your family, your real family, you'll find your way to the truth. Until then, I will continue to love you and support your dreams from whatever distance your father requires." He had known that forcing himself into my life would create chaos and pain for everyone involved. So he'd chosen to love me quietly, completely, without expectation of recognition or gratitude, the kind of selfless devotion I'd never experienced from any family member. The final letter, dated just 6 months before his death, was different. Shorter, more urgent. "My dear granddaughter, I am dying and there are things you need to know. The Delgado name carries weight in this state, weight that comes with responsibility. I have tried to build systems that will help people long after I'm gone, but systems need someone to tend them, to grow them, to fight for them when politicians try to defund them or bureaucrats try to destroy them. You don't owe me anything. But I hope someday you'll consider whether the skills and drive that got you out of Millbrook Valley might be used to help other young people do the same. There is so much work still to be done." Margaret Walsh returned with a box of tissues and a manila envelope thick with photographs. "These are from the investigation Samuel commissioned when you were 24, she said carefully. "He wanted to make sure you were thriving in Chicago, not just surviving. The photos were candid shots of my life. Me leaving my apartment building in professional clothes, laughing with colleagues at a work dinner, presenting plans at a community development meeting. But they weren't invasive or creepy. They were the careful documentation of a grandfather who desperately wanted to know that his granddaughter was happy and successful. There was something else in the envelope, a thick folder labeled Morrison and Associates Partnership Track. Inside were detailed financial projections, market analyses, and what looked like a business plan for helping me make partner at my firm ahead of schedule. Samuel had been quietly consulting with Morrison and Associates for 2 years before your hire. Not to get you the job, your portfolio and credentials did that, but to ensure that once you were there, you'd have the resources and support to advance as quickly as your talent deserved. He was manipulating my career? He was removing obstacles from your path. There's a difference. Samuel never did anything that would compromise your achievement or make your success less earned. He just made sure that discrimination and bias wouldn't hold you back from what you could accomplish on merit. The revelation was staggering. My promotion to senior architect last year, the high-profile projects I'd been assigned, the mentorship from the firm's founder, none of it had been handed to me, but the playing field had been carefully leveled by a grandfather who understood how much harder success was for people like us. "There's one more thing," Margaret said, pulling out a final document. Samuel's will includes a provision that if you choose to accept your inheritance, you must also agree to meet with someone who can help you understand what accepting the Delgado legacy really means. Not the money. Samuel assumed you'd figure out what to do with that. But the responsibility that comes with carrying his name in Illinois politics and public service. "Who?" I asked. "Governor Harrison, Samuel's protege and the closest thing he had to a son after Isabella died. Thomas has been waiting 3 years to have this conversation with you, assuming you ever learn the truth about your grandfather." I thought about my father, probably still trying to pretend that nothing had changed, that I would continue playing the role of the family disappointment who'd gotten too big for her britches. He had no idea what I'd discovered, no idea that his carefully constructed version of my story was about to be replaced with something infinitely more complex and powerful. But before I could step into Samuel's legacy, I needed to confront the man who'd stolen it from me in the first place. Not as his disappointed daughter looking for approval, but as Samuel Delgado's granddaughter demanding accountability for 30 years of lies. I stood up, gathering the letters and photographs that represented a lifetime of hidden love. "Can you arrange a meeting with Governor Harrison for next week?" "Of course. Where would you like to meet?" I smiled, feeling something fierce and determined settling into place. The Delgado Community Center in Pilsen. It's time I saw what my grandfather built, and it's time I started figuring out what I'm going to build next. But first, I had a father to face, and this time I wouldn't be going empty-handed. The drive back to Millbrook Valley felt different this time. Instead of the familiar knot of dread that usually accompanied visits home, I felt something new settling in my chest. A cold, purposeful anger that had been building for 3 days as I absorbed the full scope of what my father had stolen from me. The leather portfolio containing Samuel's letters sat on my passenger seat like a loaded weapon, along with copies of legal documents that proved exactly how much my father had known about my grandfather's attempts to stay connected.
Because Margaret Walsh had shown me something else. Correspondence between Samuel's lawyers and my father dating back to when I was 12 years old, formal letters requesting visitation rights, offers to establish college funds that wouldn't require any contact with the family, proposals for compromise that would have allowed Samuel to be part of my life while respecting Ricardo's boundaries. Every single offer had been rejected without discussion, sometimes without even the courtesy of a response. My father hadn't just been protecting himself from painful reminders. He had been actively, deliberately depriving me of a relationship with the one person in my extended family who could have understood my ambitions, my drive, my need to build something meaningful with my life. I pulled into the driveway of the small ranch house where I'd grown up, noting the peeling paint on the shutters and the overgrown garden that had been my mother's pride according to the few stories I'd been told about her. My father's truck was in the driveway, along with Uncle Fernando's car. Good.
I wanted witnesses for this conversation. Ricardo answered the door with the wary expression he'd worn since Saturday night, like he'd been expecting this confrontation, but hoping it might never come. Behind him, I could see Fernando and Carmen sitting at the kitchen table, coffee cups and worried faces indicating they'd been discussing the family crisis for days. "Angelica," my father said carefully, "I wasn't sure you'd come back. We need to talk." I held up the leather portfolio, all of us, about these. The three of them followed me into the living room, the same space where I'd spent countless childhood hours being lectured about having realistic expectations and not reaching above my station. The irony wasn't lost on me as I spread Samuel's letters across the coffee table like evidence in a trial. "These are letters my grandfather wrote to me every year on my birthday, 28 of them. Letters you made sure I never received." Carmen gasped, reaching for one of the letters before stopping herself. "Ricardo, you told us Samuel never tried to contact her." "He didn't," my father said, but his voice lacked conviction. I pulled out the legal correspondence and placed it next to the letters. "These are from Samuel's lawyers. Offers to set up college funds, requests for visitation rights, proposals for supervised meetings that would have let me know my grandfather without disrupting your life. All rejected, most of them ignored completely." Fernando was reading over Carmen's shoulder, his face growing paler with each document. "Jesus, Ricardo, he was trying to help her. Look at this. He wanted to set up a trust fund when she was 12 that would have paid for college, graduate school, everything." "Blood money," my father said, but the fight had gone out of his voice. "I didn't want his guilt money." "It wasn't guilt money," I said, pulling out my phone to show them photos from the Delgado Community Center website. "This is what Samuel built after the Eduardo Ruiz case. Programs that have helped thousands of kids get educations, find jobs, build better lives. He didn't destroy your family and then walk away. He spent the rest of his life trying to make sure other families wouldn't face the same struggles." Carmen was crying now, looking at photos of Samuel at community events, ribbon cuttings, scholarship ceremonies. "He looks like Isabella, like you," I said, my voice getting stronger. "He was Isabella's father, my grandfather, the man whose scholarship programs helped me get into Northwestern, whose urban planning principles I use in my work every day, whose foundation has been quietly supporting my career for years without me knowing it." "Supporting your career, how?" Fernando asked. I pulled out the documents Margaret Walsh had given me about Morrison and Associates. Samuel had been consulting with my firm for 2 years before I was hired. Not to get me the job, but to make sure that once I had it, I wouldn't face the kind of discrimination that might have held me back. "So your success isn't even real," my father said with a bitter laugh. "It's all his doing." The comment hit exactly wrong. I stood up, and something in my posture made all three of them straighten in their chairs. "My success is completely real. My talent, my education, my work ethic, my achievements, all of that is mine. What Samuel did was remove barriers and level playing fields. He made sure I had the same opportunities that kids from connected families take for granted." I walked to the mantelpiece where my high school graduation photo sat next to pictures of Diego and Paloma's achievements. "You want to know what's not real? This." I gestured around the room. "This fiction you created where I'm the ungrateful daughter who thinks she's better than her family. This lie where you're the long-suffering father dealing with a child who doesn't appreciate her humble roots." "Angelica," Carmen started. "No." I turned back to my father. "You didn't just keep me from knowing Samuel, you poisoned me against my own heritage, made me ashamed of wanting more than what Millbrook Valley could offer, made me feel guilty for every achievement, like success was somehow a betrayal of where I came from." My father's face was crumbling. "I was protecting you. From what? From knowing that I came from a family of builders and public servants? From understanding that my drive to create something meaningful wasn't some random personality flaw, but a family trait? From having a grandfather who would have been proud of everything I accomplished?" I pulled out the last letter Samuel had written, the one from 6 months before his death. He died 3 years ago, alone because his only remaining child had cut him off from his only grandchild. He left me everything. $47 million in foundation assets, properties, programs that help thousands of people. But more than that, he left me a legacy of service and building things that last. Fernando whistled low. 47 million? The money isn't the point, I said. The point is that I spent 30 years thinking I was an anomaly, a Ruiz who didn't fit the family mold. But I'm not a Ruiz who's different. I'm a Delgado who was raised by people who were determined to make me forget what that means. My father finally looked up at me, and for the first time in my life, I saw him clearly. Not as the authority figure whose approval I'd spent decades seeking, but as a broken man whose bitterness had cost both of us more than either of us could ever recover. "Samuel destroyed my family," he said quietly. "Your father destroyed your family when he decided to commit fraud. Samuel just made sure he faced consequences. And instead of learning from that and building something better, you spent 30 years making sure I couldn't learn from it either." I gathered up the letters on legal documents, sliding them back into the portfolio. I'm meeting with Governor Harrison next week to discuss taking over Samuel's foundation work. I'm going to learn everything I can about the programs he built and figure out how to expand them. "So, you're just going to abandon us?" Carmen asked through her tears. I looked at my aunt, this woman who had quietly supported my achievements while enabling my father's lies, and felt something soften slightly. I'm not going to stop pretending that staying small makes anyone in this family happy, but Carmen, if you want to be part of what I build next, there's always room for family who can celebrate success instead of resenting it. As I walked toward the door, my father called after me. "Angelica, wait!" I turned back, and for a moment I saw a flash of the man he might have been if he hadn't let bitterness define his life. "I'm sorry," he said. I thought if you knew about Samuel, you'd leave us completely." "You were right," I said softly. "I am leaving, but not because I think I'm better than you, because I finally understand that I'm exactly who I was always meant to be." Walking out of that house for what I suspected might be the last time, I felt like I was finally breathing freely. Samuel Delgado's granddaughter was going home. The Delgado Community Center in Pilsen was nothing like I'd expected. From the street, it looked like any other converted warehouse in the neighborhood. Red brick, large windows, modest signage that didn't scream for attention. But walking through those doors was like stepping into a universe that had been built specifically for people like me. People who'd been told they were reaching too high, dreaming too big, wanting more than they deserved. The main hall buzzed with activity even at 10 in the morning. High school students hunched over laptops in the computer lab, working with tutors who looked like they might have been in the same position just a few years earlier. Adults in work clothes practiced interview skills in a mock office setup, while their children played in a supervised area nearby. Spanish mixed with English, mixed with what sounded like Polish and Mandarin. A symphony of people building better lives in whatever language felt most comfortable. "Miss Ruiz?" A young woman approached me, her professional demeanor softened by genuine warmth. "I'm Patricia Vega, the current director. Governor Harrison is waiting for you in the conference room, but he asked if you'd like a tour first." I nodded, not trusting my voice. Every wall held photos of program graduates, kids who'd gone on to college, adults who'd started businesses, families who'd achieved citizenship or bought their first homes. And in the center of each display, like a quiet guardian overseeing it all, were photos of Samuel at various celebrations and milestones. "Your grandfather started all of this in 1995, actually, right after your mother died. Maria Santos says he channeled his grief into building something that would honor Isabella's memory and help families like yours find their footing in America." Families like mine? Immigrants, first-generation Americans, people caught in between worlds. Your grandfather understood what it felt like to build a life in a place that didn't always welcome you with open arms. He paused at a display case filled with awards and commendations. He used to say that success wasn't about forgetting where you came from, it was about building ladders so other people could climb out of the same holes you escaped.
We passed a legal aid clinic where volunteer lawyers were helping a family navigate housing discrimination, a small business incubator where a woman was presenting her food truck concept to potential investors, and a daycare center where working parents could leave their children knowing they were safe and engaged. This is just the main location, Patricia continued. We have satellite centers in Little Village, Cicero, and Berwyn. Last year alone, we helped 847 adults earn their GEDs, 312 families achieved home ownership, and 156 small businesses get off the ground. But the numbers Samuel was proudest of were the college scholarships, 2,847 students over the past 28 years.
28 years. The same number as the letters Samuel had written to me. He'd been building a ladder for strangers while his own granddaughter struggled to understand why she felt so driven to climb. The scholarship recipients come back, Patricia said, gesturing to a wall of thank you letters and success stories. They become mentors, donors, board members. Samuel always said that help should be circular. You receive it when you need it, then you give it back when you can. We stopped at a door marked Samuel Delgado Memorial Library, and Patricia's expression grew more solemn. This was his office. We've kept it exactly as he left it, hoping that someday... She trailed off, then opened the door. The room took my breath away. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined 3 walls, filled with volumes on urban planning, public policy, social justice, and community development. But the 4th wall was different. It was covered with photos, newspaper clippings, and what looked like a timeline stretching from 1995 to 2022. My timeline. My entire life documented with the meticulous care of someone who loved me from a distance. There I was at my Northwestern graduation, the photo obviously taken with a telephoto lens from across the ceremony grounds. My first day at Morrison & Associates, captured as I walked into the building wearing a navy suit I'd saved for months to afford. The groundbreaking for the community center I'd designed in Humboldt Park, my proudest professional achievement to date. He hired photographers for major events, Patricia said quietly. Not to spy on you, but so he could be there in the only way your father allowed. He has albums full of pictures like these. At the center of the wall was a blown-up photo I'd never seen before, me at the Humboldt Park groundbreaking, pointing at architectural plans while explaining the design to a group of community leaders. In the photo, I was animated, passionate, completely in my element. Below it, in Samuel's careful handwriting, was a note. Isabella would be so proud. This is exactly who she hoped you'd become. Governor Harrison was waiting for me in the conference room when I finally composed myself enough to leave Samuel's office. He stood when I entered, and I was struck again by the quiet dignity that seemed to be a family trait I was just discovering. "Angelica," he said, extending his hand, "thank you for coming. I know this has been overwhelming." "That's an understatement," I managed, taking a seat at the polished conference table. Patricia showed me around. "It's incredible what he built here." "What we built," the governor corrected. "Samuel was the visionary, but this place exists because hundreds of people believed in his dream and contributed their time, money, and expertise to make it real. That's the model he wanted you to understand. Real change happens through collaboration, not individual heroics." He slid a folder across the table. "These are the current challenges facing the foundation and the community centers. Funding cuts from the state budget, gentrification pressuring our satellite locations, a waiting list of 400 families for our home ownership program. Samuel's initial endowment was generous, but it wasn't designed to handle the increased need we're seeing." I opened the folder, my architect's brain immediately seeing the problems as design challenges that needed creative solutions. What would it take to expand, to serve more families? Money, obviously, but also political capital, community partnerships, someone who understands how to navigate both boardrooms and neighborhood meetings. He paused. Someone who inherited Samuel's vision, but also brings her own skills and perspective to the work. "You're asking me to take over his foundation. I'm asking you to consider building on his foundation, taking what he started and making it yours." Governor Harrison pulled out another document.
Samuel left detailed plans for expansion. A scholarship program specifically for kids aging out of foster care, a small business loan fund, partnerships with major employers to create apprenticeship programs, dreams he didn't live long enough to implement. I stared at the plans, seeing my grandfather's hopes for the future mapped out with the same careful precision he'd brought to watching my life from afar. I don't know anything about running a nonprofit. You know about building things that last. You know about working with communities to solve complex problems. Most importantly, you know what it feels like to succeed despite people telling you it's impossible. He smiled. Besides, Samuel didn't know anything about running a nonprofit when he started this place. He learned by doing, and he surrounded himself with people who could teach him what he didn't know. I thought about my father's words from the other night, his claim that my success wasn't real because Samuel had helped create opportunities for me. But sitting in this room, surrounded by evidence of what my grandfather had built through decades of dedicated work, I understood something fundamental about legacy and responsibility. If I do this, I said slowly, I want to expand beyond Chicago. There are communities throughout Illinois that need these programs. Samuel would have loved to hear you say that. I looked up at Governor Harrison, this man who had been like a son to my grandfather and was now offering to mentor me in carrying forward his work. When do we start? His smile was radiant. We already have. The board meeting to officially transfer leadership is next month, but there's a family I'd like you to meet first. A single mother with 2 kids who reminds me a lot of your mother at that age. She's been on our waiting list for the home ownership program for 8 months. What's her name?
Elena Martinez. She works 3 jobs to support her kids and still finds time to volunteer at the children's literacy program here twice a week. He handed me a file. I thought maybe the first family we help under your leadership should be someone who embodies everything Samuel believed about the circular nature of service. As I read Elena Martinez's story, I felt something clicking into place that had been missing my entire life. Purpose that went beyond personal success. Connection to something larger than my individual achievements. The understanding that my grandfather's blood running through my veins came with both privilege and responsibility. I wasn't just inheriting Samuel Delgado's foundation. I was finally becoming who I'd always been meant to be. 2 weeks later, I stood in the main hall of the Delgado Community Center wearing a navy blazer that had belonged to my mother, one of the few personal items Samuel's lawyers had recovered from storage, and watched as over 200 people filed into folding chairs arranged theater-style. The board of directors had called this gathering to officially announce the foundation's new leadership, but it had evolved into something much larger, a community celebration of Samuel's legacy and a chance for me to meet the people whose lives had been touched by my grandfather's vision. But I wasn't prepared for what happened when Patricia Vega took the microphone to introduce me. "Before we hear from our new director," she said, "I'd like to invite Elena Martinez to share how the Delgado Foundation has impacted her family." A small woman in her 30s approached the microphone with 2 children trailing behind her, a boy of about 8 and a girl who couldn't have been more than 5. Elena looked nervous but determined, and when she spoke, her voice carried the strength of someone who had fought for everything she achieved. 6 months ago, I was working 3 jobs and still couldn't afford a decent apartment for my kids. We were living at a studio with no heat, sharing a bathroom with 4 other families, and I was starting to think we'd never get ahead no matter how hard I worked. She paused, looking directly at me. "The Delgado Foundation didn't just help us buy our first home last week. They taught me about credit, about budgeting, about how to negotiate with contractors. They connected me with a bank that offered fair lending terms, and they gave me the confidence to believe I deserved better than what I was settling for." The little girl tugged on her mother's dress, whispering something that made Elena smile. "My daughter Sophia wants everyone to know that our new house has a big window in her bedroom where she can see the stars, and my son Miguel is excited because we have a backyard where he can practice soccer." Elena's voice caught. "But the most important thing the foundation taught me is that help isn't charity, it's investment. They invested in our family's future, and now we're committed to investing in other families' futures. I start volunteering as a financial literacy coach next month, and Sophia and Miguel understand that our success means we have a responsibility to help other kids achieve their dreams too." The applause was thunderous, but I barely heard it over the rushing in my ears.
This woman, whose name I'd first heard just 2 weeks ago, was living proof that my grandfather's philosophy actually worked. She hadn't just received help, she had been transformed into someone who could help others. When Patricia Vega introduced me, I walked to the microphone on unsteady legs, looking out at faces that ranged from young adults who might have been scholarship recipients to elderly volunteers who looked like they'd been working with Samuel since the beginning. In the back of the room, I spotted Governor Harrison giving me an encouraging nod. 2 weeks ago, I didn't know my grandfather's name. I'd spent 30 years thinking I came from nothing, believing that my drive to achieve something meaningful was some kind of personal flaw that set me apart from my family. A murmur went through the crowd. Clearly, some of them knew my story. Samuel Delgado spent 28 years loving me from a distance, supporting my dreams through scholarships and opportunities I never knew he'd help create, and building programs that would help young people like me understand that wanting more isn't selfish, it's necessary. I pulled out one of his letters, the one from my 18th birthday where he'd written about trusting that I'd find my way to the truth when I was ready. My grandfather believed that every person has the potential to build something meaningful, but that potential needs nurturing, support, and sometimes just someone who believes in you when you can't believe in yourself. An older man in the front row wiped his eyes with a handkerchief. Behind him, Elena Martinez was nodding vigorously while her children listened with the focused attention of kids who understood that something important was happening. I'm not here to replace Samuel Delgado. I'm here to build on what he started, using everything he taught me through his example and everything I learned from growing up believing I had to achieve success entirely on my own. I gestured to Elena. Families like the Martinez family are the reason this work matters, not because they needed charity, but because they had dreams that were bigger than their current circumstances, and they needed partners to help make those dreams real.
Over the next year, we're going to expand the Delgado Foundation's reach throughout Illinois. We're launching the foster care scholarship program Samuel designed but never had the chance to implement. We're creating apprenticeship partnerships with major employers who want to hire people with strong work ethics and community connections. And we're opening 2 new community centers in Rockford and Peoria, bringing these programs to families who have been driving to Chicago for services. The applause started small, but built to something that felt like celebration mixed with determination. But most importantly, we're going to formalize what Elena Martinez just demonstrated, the circular nature of help. Every family we assist will be connected with volunteer opportunities once they're stable. Every scholarship recipient will mentor younger students. Every business we help launch will commit to hiring from our job training programs. I looked directly at Elena, who is crying openly now. Because my grandfather was right. Success isn't about forgetting where you came from. It's about building ladders so other people can climb out of the same holes you escaped. As I spoke those words, Samuel's words, something profound shifted in the room. I could feel it in the way people sat up straighter, the way conversations broke out between strangers, the way Elena's children started whispering excitedly about all the kids they could help. But the moment that will stay with me forever came after my formal remarks, when the crowd had broken into smaller groups for refreshments and networking. An elderly woman approached me with tears in her eyes and a photo clutched in her weathered hands. "Mija, I'm Carmen Delgado Rivera, Samuel's cousin. I helped him start this place 28 years ago, and I want you to see something." The photo was of Samuel at the original community center opening in 1995, surrounded by the first group of families the program had served. He looked younger, hopeful, energized by the possibility of what they might build together. "He kept this picture on his desk," Carmen said, "but he always said it was incomplete. He said someday his granddaughter would stand in this room and the picture would be whole." She handed me a new photo, one someone had taken of me at the microphone just 20 minutes earlier, with Elena Martinez and her children in the background and the crowd of community members spreading out behind us. "Now it's whole," she whispered. "Now the circle is complete." Standing in that room, surrounded by the legacy my grandfather had built and the community I was now part of, I understood something fundamental about family and belonging.
I wasn't just Samuel Delgado's granddaughter anymore. I wasn't just the woman who'd escaped Millbrook Valley through determination and hidden support. I was the person who would carry his vision forward while adding my own dreams to the foundation he'd built. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I was exactly where I belonged. 6 months after taking over the Delgado Foundation, I was standing in the marble-columned lobby of the Illinois State Capitol, waiting for a meeting that would have been unimaginable just a year earlier. Today, I wasn't Angelica Ruiz, the architect who'd clawed her way out of a small town through sheer determination. I was Angelica Delgado Ruiz, director of the largest community development foundation in the state, and I was here to testify before the House Appropriations Committee about expanding funding for workforce development programs. The irony wasn't lost on me. 30 years ago, my grandfather had stood in these same halls, presenting evidence that would send my father's father to prison. Today, I was here to advocate for the kind of programs that might have helped the Ruiz family rebuild their lives instead of wallowing in bitterness and shame. Ms. Delgado Ruiz? A young aide approached me with the kind of nervous energy that reminded me of myself at her age. Committee Chair Rodriguez is ready for you? As I gathered my presentation materials, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Saw the news about your testimony today. Proud of what you're building. Dad. I stared at the message for a long moment. My father and I had spoken exactly twice since our confrontation in his living room 6 months ago. Once when Diego had gotten engaged and needed family coordination for the wedding, and once when Carmen had been hospitalized and the family had rallied around her bedside. Both conversations had been polite but distant. Two people figuring out how to relate to each other after 30 years of lies had been stripped away. But this text felt different. Not apologetic exactly, but acknowledging. Like he was finally seeing me as I actually was instead of as the disappointment he'd spent decades trying to reshape. Ms. Delgado Ruiz? The aide was waiting. I slipped my purse into my purse and followed her down the hall toward the committee room, my heels clicking against the marble floors with the confidence I'd learned from watching Governor Harrison navigate these same corridors. But when the doors opened and I saw who was sitting in the gallery, my composure nearly cracked. My father was there. Not in the front row. He'd never been comfortable with attention, but 3 rows back, wearing a suit I'd never seen before, and looking like he'd rather be anywhere else but couldn't make himself leave. Next to him sat Carmen and Fernando, and behind them were faces I recognized from the community center. Elena Martinez with her 2 children, Patricia Vega, and at least a dozen program participants who'd apparently driven to Springfield to show support. The committee chair, Perpress Rodriguez, gestured for me to take the witness table. Ms. Delgado Ruiz, thank you for being here today. We understand you have a proposal regarding the expansion of workforce development funding through community-based organizations.
I opened my presentation folder, but instead of launching into the carefully rehearsed statistics about unemployment rates and skills gaps, I found myself looking directly at my father and speaking from somewhere deeper than policy analysis. Chair Rodriguez, committee members, 6 months ago, I inherited my grandfather, Samuel Delgado's Community Development Foundation without knowing it existed. I'd spent my entire adult life believing that success meant leaving your community behind and never looking back. I thought the only way to honor my achievements was to distance myself from where I came from. Representative Johnson, a Republican from downstate, leaned forward. What changed your mind? I learned that my grandfather understood something I hadn't, that individual success without community investment is hollow, that the skills and opportunities that lifted me out of poverty could lift thousands of other families if we systematically removed the barriers that keep people trapped in cycles of underemployment and financial instability. I clicked to my first slide, showing before and after photos of families who'd gone through our programs. The Delgado Foundation currently operates 4 community centers serving 3,200 families annually, Our job training programs have an 87% employment rate within 6 months of completion, and our small business incubator has launched 156 enterprises with a 5-year survival rate of 73%, well above the national average. Representative Chen from Chicago asked, "What makes your approach different from existing workforce development programs?" We treat families, not individuals. We provide childcare during training sessions, legal aid for immigration issues that might prevent employment, financial literacy education that helps people manage increased income responsibly. Most importantly, we connect program participants with ongoing mentorship and volunteer opportunities that keep them engaged with their communities. I clicked to a slide showing Elena Martinez at her new job as a bank loan officer, a position she'd been promoted to after completing our financial services training program. Elena Martinez was working 3 minimum wage jobs 6 months ago. Today, she's a loan officer helping other families achieve home ownership, and she volunteers 20 hours a month mentoring women in our entrepreneurship program. The questions came rapid fire after that. Budget projections, success metrics, partnerships with existing agencies, oversight mechanisms. I answered each one with the confidence that comes from knowing your work inside and out. But part of my attention remained focused on my father's face in the gallery. He was listening, really listening, maybe for the first time in his life, to me explaining work that mattered to me. And slowly, as I described program after program designed to help families rebuild from financial devastation, I saw understanding dawning in his expression. "One final question," Chair Rodriguez said. "Your grandfather's work in the Inspector General's office was sometimes controversial. How do you respond to critics who might see the Delgado Foundation as an attempt to rehabilitate his legacy?" The question hit exactly where it was designed to hurt, and I felt my father tense in his seat 3 rows back. But I'd been expecting this moment, preparing for it since the day I learned Samuel's full story. My grandfather, Samuel Delgado's legacy doesn't need rehabilitation, I said clearly. He spent 30 years ensuring that public money served public purposes, that corruption couldn't hide behind family connections or political convenience. The families who lost their livelihoods when he exposed fraud deserved better than silence about their loved ones' crimes. I paused, looking directly at my father. But those families also deserved programs that could help them rebuild honestly. That's what the Delgado Foundation provides. Not charity for people who've made mistakes, but opportunities for families who want to create better lives through legitimate work and community engagement. My father's eyes were bright with unshed tears, and I saw him nod almost imperceptibly. The Eduardo Ruiz fraud case hurt many families, including my father's family. But hiding from that history, pretending it didn't happen, refusing to learn from it, that only perpetuates the cycle of shame and missed opportunity. The workforce development programs we're proposing would give families facing financial crisis the tools to rebuild legitimately instead of taking shortcuts that ultimately hurt everyone. When the hearing ended an hour later, the committee voted unanimously to advance our funding proposal to the full House. But the victory felt secondary to what happened as I gathered my materials and prepared to leave. My father approached the witness table with the hesitant steps of someone crossing a bridge he'd been afraid to walk for 30 years. "Angelica," he said quietly, you sounded like your mother up there. Passionate but precise. Isabella always knew exactly what she believed and why." "Thank you for coming," I said, meaning it completely. "I brought something for you." He pulled a small photo from his jacket pocket, my parents' wedding picture, the same one Governor Harrison had shown me months earlier, but this copy was creased from years of handling. I kept this on my desk at the shop, looked at it every day for 28 years, and wondered what she'd think of the man I was becoming. I took the photo, studying my mother's radiant face and my father's tense expression with new understanding. "She'd be proud of what you built today," he said. "And she'd be proud that you're strong enough to do what I never could. Face the truth about our family and build something better from it."
As we walked out of the Capitol together, not as the disappointed father and ungrateful daughter we'd been for so long, but as two people finally ready to move forward from the past that had shaped us both, I realized this was what redemption actually looked like. Not dramatic confrontations or tearful apologies, but the quiet work of choosing truth over comfortable lies, community over isolation, building over tearing down. Samuel Delgado's daughter was finally home.
5 years have passed since that day in the Capitol, and as I sit in my grandfather's old office at the Delgado Community Center, I'm surrounded by evidence of what happens when people stop hiding from their potential and start building toward it. The walls that once held only Samuel's careful documentation of my life from afar now display photos from groundbreaking ceremonies, scholarship graduations, and ribbon cuttings from the 12 community centers we've opened across Illinois. But it's the smaller moments captured in these photos that tell the real story. Elena Martinez shaking hands with the first family she helped secure a home loan in her new role as our housing program coordinator. My cousin Diego, yes, Diego, my half-brother, who spent years believing college wasn't for people like us, accepting his social work degree at 34 so he could join our family services team. My father standing beside me at the dedication of the Eduardo Ruiz Memorial Scholarship Fund, a program we created specifically for children of incarcerated parents who want to break cycles of shame and build legitimate success. That scholarship fund was my idea, though it took 3 years of careful conversation before my father was ready to let his father's name be associated with opportunity instead of just disgrace. When we announced it, applications poured in from across the state. Kids who understood that their parents' mistakes didn't have to define their futures, that there was a path from generational shame to generational pride. The first recipient was a 17-year-old girl from Rockford, whose father had been imprisoned for embezzlement when she was 12. In her application essay, she wrote, "My dad's choices taught me that shortcuts always cost more than they save. I want to become a teacher so I can help kids understand that the hard way is usually the only way that lasts." She's starting her junior year at Northwestern this fall. Yes, Northwestern, on a full scholarship that covers not just tuition, but also the kind of wraparound support services I wish had existed when I was struggling to find my place in a world that felt too big and complicated to navigate alone. The knock on my office door interrupts my reflection. "Come in," I call, expecting Patricia with updates on our newest center opening in Peoria. Instead, it's a young woman I don't recognize, maybe 19 or 20, with the kind of nervous energy I remember from my own early days in Chicago. She's clutching a folder against her chest like it contains her entire future. "Ms. Delgado Ruiz, I'm Sofia Martinez, Elena Martinez's daughter. I have an appointment." Sophia! The little girl who used to whisper to her mother during community meetings, who was excited about the big window in her bedroom where she could see the stars. Now she's a sophomore at DePaul University, studying urban planning with a minor in social justice advocacy. "Sophia! I've been looking forward to this meeting. Please sit down." She settles into the chair across from my desk, her nervousness giving way to the kind of focused determination I recognize in myself at that age. "I want to propose a new program for the foundation, something specifically for first-generation college students who feel caught between their family's expectations and their own dreams." I lean forward, intrigued. "Tell me more." When I got to DePaul, I realized I wasn't the only one struggling with guilt about succeeding when my family was still working multiple jobs just to get by. There are dozens of us, kids whose parents sacrificed everything to give us opportunities, but now we don't know how to navigate success without feeling like we're abandoning where we came from. She opens her folder, revealing a detailed program proposal, complete with budget projections, partnership possibilities, and outcome measurements. The work is sophisticated, thorough, exactly what I'd expect from someone who'd grown up watching her mother transform from survival mode to community leadership.
I want to create support groups, mentorship programs, maybe even a scholarship fund for students who commit to bringing their skills back to serve their communities after graduation. Not immediately. I understand people need to establish their careers first, but eventually. As she talks, I see myself at 19, driven but directionless, ambitious but ashamed of that ambition. I see Elena at 30, working 3 jobs while volunteering to help other families because she understood that success meant responsibility. I see my father at 60, finally ready to let his father's name be associated with redemption instead of just ruin. Sophia, I say when she finishes her presentation, this is exactly the kind of program your grandfather Samuel would have loved. She looks confused. My grandfather? I smile, realizing she's never heard the full story of how the foundation operates, how success creates family ties that go deeper than blood. Everyone who's been transformed by these programs becomes part of our extended family. Samuel always believed that help should be circular. You receive it when you need it, then you give it back when you can. So you'll consider the proposal? I'll do more than consider it. I want you to present it to our board next month. And if they approve it, which I'm confident they will, I want you to run it as your summer internship first, then part-time during the school year, and full-time after graduation if you're interested. Her face lights up with the kind of joy that makes all the long hours and difficult conversations worthwhile. Really? Really? But I have one condition. Her smile falters slightly. What condition?
I want you to call it the Elena Martinez First Generation Success Program, because none of this would exist without your mother's courage to accept help when she needed it and give help when she could. Sophia's eyes fill with tears. She's going to cry when I tell her. Good tears, I hope. The best tears. She still has that photo from the first day we moved into our house. Me and Miguel standing in the backyard where he practices soccer now, her holding the keys like they were made of gold. She keeps it on her desk at the bank to remind herself that helping other families achieve home ownership isn't just her job, it's her mission. As Sophia leaves to call her mother with the news, I turn back to the wall of photos that chronicle 5 years of lives changed, dreams achieved, cycles broken. But the image that captures my attention isn't from a formal ceremony or program graduation. It's a candid shot from last Christmas, taken at the community center's annual holiday celebration. In the photo, Elena Martinez is helping a new family, recent immigrants from El Salvador, navigate the paperwork for our English classes while her son Miguel translates for their teenage daughter. Behind them, my father is teaching a group of kids how to make traditional tamales, while my Aunt Carmen organizes gift bags for families going through temporary financial hardship. At the center of the photo, almost lost in the busy scene, is a small plaque I had installed last year, in memory of Samuel Delgado, who understood that building community means building bridges, not walls. My phone buzzes with a text from an unknown number, and I assume it's another program participant reaching out for support or guidance. Instead, it's from someone I haven't heard from in months. Saw the news about the Peoria Center opening. Mom would be proud of what you've built in her father's name. Congratulations, Elena Rodriguez, your cousin from Aunt Carmen's side. Elena Rodriguez. I'd forgotten that my extended family included people I'd never met, connections severed by my father's determination to keep me isolated from my mother's relatives. Now they were reaching out, wanting to be part of what we were building, ready to heal relationships that had been broken by grief and stubbornness and too many years of silence. I typed back quickly. Would love to meet you and hear stories about my mother. Coffee next week? Her response comes immediately. I have a whole box of Isabella's letters and photos that Dad saved. Been waiting 30 years for the right time to share them. As I close my laptop and prepare to head home to my house in Evanston,
Samuel's house, which I'd renovated but never truly changed because it already felt like home the first time I walked through its doors, I think about the question I posed to my audience in that very first video story I shared months ago. I asked what people would do if they discovered their whole life was built on someone else's shame and fear, if they'd stay silent or demand the truth. What I've learned is that the truth isn't a destination, it's a foundation. Once you have it, the real work begins. The work of building something worthy of the sacrifices made by people who loved you enough to invest in your future even when they couldn't be part of your present. Tonight, I'm going home to a house filled with my grandfather's books and my mother's photos and the sound of neighbors' children playing in yards that exist because Samuel Delgado believed communities could be places where everyone had room to grow. Tomorrow, I'll come back to this office and continue building programs that help families move from survival to stability to service, because that's what Samuel taught me through his example and his letters and the legacy he left in capable hands. You don't win by proving people wrong. You win by becoming undeniable. And the best part about becoming undeniable? Once you do it, you get to help other people do it too. That's the real family legacy, not the money or the buildings or even the programs, though all of those matter. It's the understanding that success without service is just another form of selfishness, and that the highest honor you can give to the people who invested in your dreams is to invest in someone else's. So, tell me, what legacy are you building? What dreams are you helping come true? What community are you strengthening through your success? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. And who knows? Maybe your story will inspire the next program we create, the next family we serve, the next cycle of shame we help transform into a cycle of pride. Because this isn't really the end of my story. It's the beginning of a story that's bigger than any one person, any one family, any one generation. It's the story of what happens when people stop hiding from their potential and start building toward it together. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.